Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Overseas Development Institute for this meeting on how smart trade policy can help Africa industrialize. It's a fascinating topic, and we'll be hoping to have a very interesting discussion. Welcome also the online viewers as well. Welcome here at ODI. You can follow this meeting online. You can also use the Africa Trade hashtag. Now, the topic of today, the link between trade and industrialization, is not a new one. We've been discussing that for quite some time. But I suppose there are a couple of new issues that are coming up as well. And in that context, I think it is important to discuss that. For example, the context within which African countries are now is that they do like to industrialize. So the question is, how can African countries industrialize more than they have done so far? There's also a new trade context as well. Of course, the WTO issues are taking place, but there's already a question, has the WTO really been helpful for the African continent so far in terms of trade policy? But there are also issues in terms of external trade policies that you can think about. So the UK is thinking about new trade relationships with developing countries post-Brexit. So thinking about economic partnership agreements and the rollover of EPAs provides a new context in which we're discussing trade and industrialization issues. The US just recently suggested to a range of East African countries that they should not ban second-hand clothing imports, the Mitumba ban, or otherwise they will lose preferences, the AGOA preferences in the US. These are sort of external trade issues, but of course internally there are also a range of issues that we're interested in discussing, and we'll be hearing, of course, today around the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the CFTA in Africa, thinking about liberalizing trade within the region, and that this is going to be launched next month. At the same time, there are also lots of intra-regional trade isn't working for industrialization. So there's a lot of issues that we need to discuss here. And we will do that on the basis of, first of all, a report that has been published through a partnership jointly between the Overseas Development Institute and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And this is the report, and you may have had a copy. You can get it outside. There are maybe one or two copies here, and that has been authored by the ODI and UNECA jointly, and we'll be hearing on that, and then we'll discuss that in greater detail. So we've got an expert panel to discuss these issues. We've got experts, trade experts, who also live or know the region extremely well. And so we'll start off with Linda Calabrese, who is a research fellow here at the Overseas Development Institute. She's also been working on trade issues in East Africa, and she worked there for about 4 years, so she knows those issues really well. She's been a co-author of the report. David Luke is the coordinator at the African Trade Policy Center at the UNECA. We're very fortunate that you've been able to come over to discuss the report, and no doubt you will talk a lot about the CFTA, which is your area of expertise, and a range of other issues as well, and probably the world expert on the CFTA. So we're very lucky to have you here. And then we'll be having two comments, contributions. First of all, from Chi Atanga, who is a Commonwealth citizen, Cameroonian and UK. I say that because he's also a fellow committee member of the APPG inquiry into the role of the Commonwealth in trade. And we were hoping to publish a report in the coming few weeks. But he's also a co-founder of an African fashion company, and it's called Walls of Benin, and you'll be talking a bit more on that, and also the issues that you face in terms of trading with Africa. And then we'll be hearing from Abi Kadir, who used to be at the UNECA, but he's a distinguished academic here in the UK MBA at the University of Sheffield and working on trade and industrialisation issues. I will be asking the speakers, the panelists, to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes each, and then after that there will be question and answers, and we'll hope to involve you and also the audience online. So without further ado, Linda, maybe you would provide an introduction to the report and what's in it, and what is smart about the trade policy that we want to hear about the contribution to industrialisation.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dirk. I'm glad to be here today to be talking about this report on transforming African economies through smart trade and industrial policy. As Dirk mentioned, this is something that we have produced together with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And you can find some copies out here, and if not, it's available online, both this report and a shorter policy brief that pulls out the main points. Because we only have a short time today, I'm going to highlight some of the key points that we make in the report. But then you're welcome to read it. There's a lot of information and data and case studies in the report itself. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to focus on 3 main points. The first one is why have we worked on this report? The second one is what's the current situation in Africa in terms of trade policy and industrialization? And the final one is, based on this, what should we do to improve, to use trade policy in a smart way to promote industrialization? So very briefly, industrialization, Africa's experience with industrialization has been disappointing. Africa's manufacturing has declined, and this is across a range of dimensions. So both in terms of manufacturing value added as a share of GDP, this has declined since the 90s. Manufacturing goods as a share of African exports have declined as well. As you can see in this graph, the dark blue part there is manufacturing goods, and this has declined. But also Africa's share of global manufacturing has declined. So across a number of dimensions, Africa's role in manufacturing has shrunk in the past few decades. But African countries, many countries, are aware that industrialization is important, and they are aware that this is a tool for them to achieve a number of policy objectives, a variety of policy objectives. That can be improved trade balance in some cases, or it can be job creation and so on. So they understand that, and they want to use industrialization to achieve these policy objectives. And this is happening, this sort of increased understanding is not only taking place at the national level, but also at the regional level. We know of a number of regional economic communities that have industrialization strategies and policies, and also at the continental level with at the African Union level. So this is sort of a current trend at the moment. So in 2015, UNECA's economic report on Africa was on industrializing through trade. And this report made the link between trade and trade policy and industrialization. And so with this report, we are trying to take those findings forward, and we're trying to assess what trade policy is doing currently for industrialization in Africa, and if not enough, what else could be done. So on my second point, on the current situation and existing challenges, there's a number of challenges on trade and trade policy on one side and industrialization on the other side. So the first ones I want to highlight are internal challenges. African countries have face very high trading costs. The cost of moving goods, moving both imports in the countries, and then once goods are produced to export in these goods, are quite high, way higher than other regions. And this put African firms, and it undermines the competitiveness of African firms because they face higher costs. And so it's difficult for them to compete with producers in other regions such as South Asia or Southeast Asia, which do not face such high costs. And the second challenge is the presence of high tariffs. And high tariffs not in general, but specifically what we want to highlight is the presence of high tariffs on on capital goods that are necessary for production. So as you can see here, Africa's imports of capital goods and intermediate goods are increasing, but most of these come from outside Africa. So if these tariffs are very high, this makes it more expensive. This makes African goods more expensive. And here we compare these tariffs on a number of intermediate goods for Africa, East and Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world. And consistently, Africa's tariffs are higher, except in the food industry, where Southeast Asia has higher tariffs. So we've spoken about the internal challenges, but there are also some external challenges. The first one I want to highlight is about preferences. So preference granting countries define what products are going to be granted preferential access to their markets, but also the terms and conditions, the rules of origins, the standards. So in some cases, these are not aligned with productive capacities of African producers. So it might be difficult for them to produce according to the standards that are requested. And the second challenge is one of reciprocity. So existing agreements, such as the EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreements with the EU, call for greater reciprocity in the future. So they call for greater opening of the African market in exchange for an opening of the EU market. And the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is an agreement with the US, is going to expire in 2025, and this might be replaced by something that also calls for greater reciprocity, right? So in this sense, it might be a challenge for African countries, which might be faced to a sudden competition from producers in other countries because of this increased reciprocity. So, based on these points that I raised, what are the recommendations? So the first one is about trade policy. So we believe that trade policy should be aligned with industrialization objectives, and this should be done in a way that brings industrialization at the core of trade policy, not only on paper but also in terms of implementation. So just to give you an example, the East African Community has a tariff structure that allows imports of intermediate and raw materials at lower tariffs, and this should induce production. But what happens in practice is that goods that are used as inputs in the production process are actually taxed with higher rates because they are considered finished products. So if I'm a garment producer in Tanzania, for example, and I want to import labels or buttons for the shirts I'm making, these should be considered inputs and should be taxed at 10%, but sometimes they are considered finished products because they look like they are complete products, and they're taxed at 25%. So this makes me, as a producer, less competitive. So this is something that should be addressed. In terms of trade agreements, these should also be aligned with industrialization objectives and should be sequenced in a smart way. So in a way that decreases tariffs on inputs and intermediate goods first. And then the reduction of trade cost is also crucial. So until it remains very costly to trade within Africa or with Africa, then it's very unlikely that African firms are going to be very competitive on the global market. And finally, these are the things that we can do with trade, but there's a number of things that trade policy cannot do, but that still need to be addressed to promote industrialization. And these are complementary measures that governments need to take care of. Building capacity and building skills for producers, providing infrastructure that allow easier and cheaper transport of goods, and providing services which are crucial to the manufacturing sector. So the obvious one are, of course, good transport and logistics and financial services, but there are also others, such as professional services, accounting and legal services and so on, which are very important for the development of the manufacturing sector. So with these recommendations in mind, I think I've concluded my presentation. So thank you very much.
Good, thank you very much. That's been very helpful. Thanks, that's great. So the smart part of trade policy is in sort of alignment, it's in sequencing and the complementary measures. And I think also reading through your report, it's around targeting sectors. So really the smart targeting is important. Afterward, I'm going to ask you whether the the ban on mitumba is smart in that context, but that may be for later. Very good. That's good. We now go over to David to be discussing the CFTA and to what extent that is helping and consistent with industrialization continent.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and this is a wonderful turnout, and so thank you to everyone here for the interest in the subject. Let me also thank you, Dirk and ODI, for collaborating on this project, as well as other things that we're doing together. We're at UNECA. We're very appreciative of this. Of course, the subject that we're discussing today is very much at the heart of the current effort to transform African economies, to ensure sustainable economic growth, to impact poverty reduction, to make significant progress with the SDGs. So it's very much at the heart of current efforts and discussion. So the importance of industrialization and structural transformation is growing in attention. It's one of the 4 priorities, for example, that the Kenyan president has established following the recent election. And in the report, and I think this is important so that we set out the parameters. In the report, we define and we understand economic transformation as the process of moving labor and other resources from lower productivity to higher productivity activities and raising within sector productivity growth. So on the basis of this definition that we use in the report, we see economic transformation as having 2 main components: within sector productivity growth and between sector changes. And this is what then we refer to as structural transformation. Now, most of the recent growth in African countries has been driven by relatively high commodity prices rather than within sector productivity growth. And this is problematic since it raises issues of sustainability that risk leading to an eventual declining overall growth. So the African Union's Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, then emphasizes that the continent must move towards structural transformation, including agro transformation, for job creation, infrastructure development, and poverty reduction. The trade-related priorities of Agenda 2063 are clear. The agenda calls for developing productive capacities, boosting intra-African trade, and the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is actually the first flagship program of Agenda 2063. Now, this is to be supported by a comprehensive program to boost intra-African trade. These are some of the complementary measures that Linda highlighted. And there are 7 key areas for this program on boosting intra-African trade, 7 key policy clusters on trade-related infrastructure, trade facilitation, trade finance, trade information, trade policy coherence, productive capacity, and factor mobility. So the essential principle at work here is that trade is predominantly between neighbors, and the need to tackle the obstacles to the growth of inter-African trade and reverse the distortions arising from the way Africa was inserted into the global economy since the 16th century. And indeed, African export markets are more diversified and industrialized and therefore offer significant opportunity for industrial upgrading. So as highlighted in the report that we are launching today, in 2014, manufactured goods accounted for 41.9% of inter-African exports, compared with only 14.8% of Africa's exports outside the continent. So in the rest of my remarks, I'll outline the thinking on the role the Continental Free Trade Area could play in Africa's industrial development and provide a brief update on the CFTA process so far, what has been achieved, the challenges ahead, and the role ECA and the Trade Policy Center at ECA expects to play in meeting these challenges. So substantial strides have been made to drive integration and industrialization at the level of the regional economic communities. But enhanced cooperation at continental level is now needed to scale up and provide the scale economies necessary to make African products and services globally competitive. So the CFTA negotiations, which were launched on the 15th of June 2015, is part of this of the answer. The CFTA will create a single African market of 55 member states, comprising more than 1 billion people and with a total GDP of around 2.5 trillion. This promises to enable sufficient economies of scale, drive competitiveness, and attract significant investment into Africa. Ambitious tariff liberalization under the CFTA will boost incentives to source inputs and intermediates from within Africa, which is expected to support the expansion of the manufacturing sector and enhance productivity of African goods and services. This is needed for the development of competitive regional value chains and to better position the continent to integrate into global value chains and benefit from the global trading system. The collaboration and cooperation of the regional economic communities through the CFTA should also help to accelerate progress in regional projects aimed at unlocking the binding constraints to inter-African trade and industrialization. So ECA modeling exercises indicate that establishing the CFTA would boost inter-African trade by 52.3%. Estimated increases are highest for industrial products, 53.3%, and substantially higher with supportive trade facilitation measures. The CFTA then is considered as a major pillar for Africa's industrialization, and the African countries recognize the role the CFTA can play in achieving their industrial development aspirations. And the provisions are being built into the agreement that are consistent with the imperative of industrial development, building on the current trade-led industrialization objectives of the regional economic communities. The industrial pillar of the CFTA is expected to enhance industry and enterprise-level competitiveness through exploiting scale economies, reducing business costs and enhancing market access, improve the allocation of resources, support the development of trade-related infrastructure, overcome dependence on the export of primary products, and support the development of competitive agribusinesses and reduce the continent's food import bill. The scope of the CFTA agreement currently covers trading goods, trading services, investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy, and is expected to be expanded to include e-commerce. The wide scope reflects the importance African leaders attach to using the CFTA as a vehicle for promoting industrialization and developing regional value chains. As highlighted in the report, inclusion of trading services is crucial to reducing inter-African trade costs and developing competitive African industries. The CFTA will also help to address some key challenges to improving Africa's business environment, including non-tariff barriers, trade harmonization, customs cooperation, and trade facilitation. Now, what progress has been made in the negotiation process so far? So since the launch of the negotiations, the progress has resulted in the conclusion of the first phase of the negotiations, which, as I said, covered trading services and trading goods. The AUC, the African Union Commission, which is leading the process, we have seen the refinement and amendment of through a series of negotiating rounds on the text that have been used for the negotiations. The CFTA agreement, which has been approved, also establishes governance structures and other institutional arrangements, as well as the protocol on trade in services. An ambitious target of 90% tariff liberalization has been agreed, with the remaining 10% accounted by exclusion lists and sensitive items to be determined on a bilateral basis. The African Ministers of Trade tasked negotiators to complete the outstanding work on trading goods and on dispute settlement by March this year. Much of this work on trade remedies, simplified rules of origin, which would be applicable on entry into force of the agreement, is now being worked on. The dispute settlement aspect of the agreement has been completed. The final round of negotiations, the 10th round, is planned for early March to finalize the text on goods. And the AU summit in January this year agreed to have an extraordinary summit to sign the agreement on the 21st of March. So in sum, what I'm saying here is that the CFTA agreement covering services, covering goods, and all the technical issues relating to rules of origin, dispute settlement, trade remedies, these have been completed. Now, the next phase, and I'll end with this, the next phase of the negotiations will deal with the outstanding subjects, which include, as I said, intellectual property, competition policy, and investment, and possibly also e-commerce. And we at ECA will continue to work with the AUC to support the next phase of the negotiations. We're developing a tool, a sort of scorecard on implementing the CFTA, which we would use to see how well African countries are doing in terms of implementing the agreement, in terms of tracking the benefits from the agreement. And doing this not so much only from the point of view of compliance with the agreement, but also to see what development benefits, especially as it relates to this overarching emphasis on industrial development is concerned. So I'll stop here, and of course we'll be able to come back.
Okay, yeah. Very good, thanks. Just when and where will the CFTA be launched?
In Kigali on March 21st. So
that's pretty soon. You make it sound very straightforward and easy process, isn't it? So on theory, this is all this is what's going to happen, and I suppose some of it is happening. So I was last week in Kenya and Tanzania, and there is sort of trade between the countries a lot. There are value chains, but there are also trade spats, and even within a customs union, there are problems, and they've got divergent external tariffs and so on. So there's quite a lot of challenges on the ground. But let's discuss that in a minute. Thanks for this update. That's very helpful. Let's now go to discussons, and you've got a presentation. Chi, over to you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, there you go.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay,
that's fine. We'll leave it there for now. So I'm not an economist. I work in fashion and textiles. And when I want to be more poetic, I say I work at the intersection of fashion, creativity, policy, and trade and development. I consider myself an African industrialist. I'm absolute in my mission and vision to create social and economic value with Africa. Now, I chose fashion, which is, of course, relative to manufacturing, because in developing nations, after agriculture, manufacturing is the largest employer of people. It requires a higher order of magnitude vis-a-vis inputs, outputs, which is what we want. And unlike homogeneous crops, with fashion, there's the opportunity for Africanness to be a USP. So that's where I am. You'll have to excuse me. So I started the company in 2015, raised a grant from the Portuguese government, went through an accelerator program for creative companies with global potential, and now I'm raising finance to launch African production. I have the value chain set up and some great partners in Kenya. So Kenya's the focus of my brief talk. Now, according to the head of Hivos East Africa, Kenya, the Kenyan manufacturing industry has the potential to create 300,000 jobs. They're currently at about 39,000. That's a big disparity. Why? What do we need to do to create the 300,000 jobs? What's the solution? I believe part of the solution is smart industrial policy, which I'm going to refer to as SIP from now on, just to be brief. So what is SIP? What is that? Well, I'll start off by defining what it's not. It's not blanket general enabling policy. It's not AGOA. It's not EBA. I mean, they're helpful, but if it were that simple, then the Kenyan exports would have been completely transformed instead of actually dropping in real terms. SIP it's bespoke. It's smart. It requires different agents involved in the process, from the government to the private sector. They need to work together very closely, and I think that the governments should be very instrumental in helping to create success stories. In terms of manufacturing, I'd like to cite the example of Helen High with C&H in, I'm seeing some smiles, with C&H in Kigali. There was a lot of help from the government in setting things up. So SIP, to conclude that point, SIP requires focus, master plans, plans within the plans, and it requires a lot of focus and attention from the government. Okay, so now I'll draw your attention to... so these are three ideas that I had, specifically focusing on Kenya. Three suggestions for smart industrial policy. So there are some numbers there, but the meta point is that even at full capacity, I think there's something like 52 fabric mills in Kenya. Only 10 of them are in operation, and they're running at 45%. But even if they were all working at full capacity, there still wouldn't be enough supply to satisfy even the local market, never mind exports. So that means fabric is coming from outside. It must. Certainly for exports, 95% of the exported textiles are coming from outside. So what would be a smart solution? Would it make sense for the government to partner with another government and offer extra incentives for preferences, on the proviso that partner country would provide, would potentially invest further down the road in manufacturing, in helping to build up the Kenyan industry? Certainly they would be expected to share knowledge and know-how. The second smart industrial policy idea or suggestion that I had is in regard to finance, which is of course a major issue and stumbling block for many companies, especially at the SME level. Now, a study took place in Kenya, and some SMEs were interviewed, and 87% of the SMEs used retained capital to finance operations. Very, very difficult. Things move very, very slowly on that basis. 35% used capital from friends and family. 19% used credit from suppliers and such, and only 9% used institutional capital. I believe that the government should make public funds available for the manufacturing sector, specifically for SMEs, just like the Portuguese do. And I raised the grant from the Portuguese government, just like the British government does. In fact, it's quite interesting, the British government for the first time have made a grant available to the textile manufacturing industry, and exports have increased. Surprise, surprise. The last point I raised. So this is. By the way, does anyone know the sexiest industry in Europe? Apparently, it's the. Well, it says it right there. Apparently, the Portuguese shoe industry is the sexiest industry in Europe. And the point I'm making is that there needs to be organization to really develop the industry and to develop exports. The Portuguese and the British have several industrial bodies that, in the context of fashion, will help companies reach new markets. They'll provide information which are the fairs to go to, and they'll partly finance those trips. That doesn't exist in Kenya. In order to boost exports and to build the industry, that's needed. So there's a lack of coordination. There's no strong governmental or non-governmental body, and that is needed to develop the industry. Mm-hmm. So that's very, very brief. Some thoughts from my experience and my perspective, and I'll be sharing a lot more on Twitter at CK_Atanga.
Okay, thank you, Chief. I mean, I suppose about Kenya, and as you mentioned, David, was that sort of the new president, Kenyatta, has said that the manufacturing sector is one of the 4 priorities, or sort of the big 4.
Of course.
Thinking about rolling it out, and I also visited one of the promising garments firms in Kenya last week, and I think the issue of finance also did come up actually. So. Previously, they were relying on capital from other countries, but the commercial sector doesn't necessarily understand the garment sector, and so how do you get credit? And in Asian countries, they understand it better, and there was a gap basically, and there was a discussion also with maybe there's a role for development finance institutions to be thinking more around supporting the manufacturing sector, and a development finance institution like a DEG in Germany, about 20% of its portfolio is in the manufacturing sector, whereas for example here in the CDC so far it's only been 2%, but I think they have plans to increase it. So there's an issue around financing, and they wanted to expand. They were like a booming company. Within 1 year, they had $40 million US worth of exports, employing 4,000 people. So there are some success stories, but a lot it needs to happen still to transform the economy. So there are some issues, some very useful practical issues there that you highlighted. So Abhi, over to you for the final set of comments before we go to the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and reuniting me with my former colleague from ECA. I would start to give a very, very brief background into the whole discussion and also some reflections I have on the report. I like the point that you made about the sexiest industry in Portugal. I think the sexiest industry in Africa is the shoe industry in Ethiopia. Because my country is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is smart in more or less in the last 15 years. It showed that it can be moving from nowhere to somewhere. Because it is making a lot of good progress. I say this because I want to relate it to smart policy in the context that it picked a competitive advantage that it has in terms of being the largest cattle, owning the largest cattle in the continent and using that as a very, very good input into the shoe processing plants that we have in the industrial parks. Now, I'm not speaking as an official, I'm not speaking as a UN official, I'm not speaking as an Ethiopian official, but as an academic. Let me just give you the following brief background of the optimism that I have when it comes to industrialization through trade. When I joined the ECA in 2014, I was tasked to coordinate the economic report on Africa, particularly focusing on industrialization. Starting from, actually, ECA started it before I joined. ECA was banging drums about industrialization in 2013, 14, 15, 16, and 17 was greening industrialization. So the environment element was also included. So that really makes me optimistic about putting industrialization on the map, because the whole continent, no, the whole planet was thinking that Africa cannot industrialize. You just specialize on agriculture. And that is not true. Another important aspect that we see in terms of the economic history of African economies is that structural transformation has taken place. That means relative importance of agriculture declined and the service sector expanded. Therefore, we really missed the ship to industrialize in between. And we have the fastest urbanization without industrialization. But now we are moving into this policy drive, linking trade policy with industrialization and linking industry with agriculture, linking trade with foreign direct investment, because without foreign direct investment, you don't have the internal capacity or the complexity of the products that you can produce and sell to the rest of the world. Therefore, the case can be made by instituting smart trade policies. We can really promote industrialization within the continent and the globe. But there are challenges. Some of the challenges that are not highlighted in the report are, for instance, there are very, very powerful protectionist policies against Africa's industrialization efforts globally. Subsidy is one example. For instance, the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union. I say I will be speaking my mind. Therefore, recently, for instance, CAP is in trouble because the UK is pulling out of European Union, and this has been discussed. Is that an opportunity for Africa? I think we can sit and debate that. In terms of opportunities, or let me go back to this smart policy. What is smart about the trade policies that Africa can do? I think some of them were already discussed. One was raised by David on industrialization being related to trade, because in the past, trade was not really linked with industry development within the continent. The second was mentioned by Chi, which is like the government support for the private sector, which was missing. And some industrializers have already done some great work, which we can really learn from. Mauritius, for instance. There was a very good interdependence between the private sector and the government. Even the government promoting and funding trade shows for small and medium enterprises. The good news maybe for some countries such as Ethiopia is that the finance minister, Abraham, is very keen on SMEs because he did his PhD on SMEs. And not because he did his PhD on SMEs, because from economic development we know that growth, youth employment, and transformation of economies is anchored on the development of small and medium enterprise. So Africa should be serious about supporting SMEs. Another work that I did for the World Bank at some point in the past, in my previous life as an academic before I joined the United Nations, was on foreign direct investment and trade logistics. Now many African countries are trying to attract foreign direct investment, and there are also improvements on ease of doing business. The biggest investor, I think it is not a surprise, is China, for instance, in Ethiopia or in some of the African countries. This is good because most of the industrial parks are populated by firms which are market seeking, which are also help us to market light manufacturing items in the context of rising light manufacturing costs of Chinese production. But there is a catch. Foreign direct investment doesn't just come because you have AGOA access and to take advantage of that. You have to have a very good human development in place to attract foreign direct investment. I say that because the Chinese foreign direct investment report in 2013 indicated or highlighted one big constraint for them not to go to some parts of Africa is because of poor labor quality. You go to places to save on labor costs, but eventually, if you had to send the workforce to Beijing for training, you are not going to save on labor costs. Therefore, that is part of the homework that Africa should do in terms of really building a very good human capital there. So that is smart. If you have a good, affordable, educated labor force, that is smart. I think in terms of whether there is demand, I think in my sleep that is always what I ask. Is there really demand for the products of Africa? But I'll say more at some point.
Okay, very good, thanks. So that's been a really good overview of what's in the report, and also about what is smart around this. So alignment, or just linking trade and industrial development, is an important part of that. Not just trade tariffs for revenue raising, but think about the industrialisation component of this. Sequencing was mentioned. Government support, so I suppose we need to think about what is appropriate support there. You mentioned green issues as well. But at the same time, it may not always be happening, and there might be some individual issues where it is happening. So Ethiopia is an example. This one firm that we saw in Kenya, it's not happening. You mentioned already there's the protectionism around the corner, whether it is the common agricultural policy or the sort of the lobbies that led to Brexit and the US in terms of externally. But the same happens, of course, internally as well. So that the trade spats that I was referring to, the Tanzania is increasing its tariffs on Kenyan products, for example. So that is also the reality on the ground as well. So that's also something we need to be discussing. And there are the other issues that are coming up, like the Me Too bans.